Welcome to PRISM Rounds, the audio journal club where we break down one study at a time for ICU, ED, and pulmonary/critical care teams, physicians, trainees, nurses, pharmacists, and respiratory therapists. A quick note before we start, this episode is created using AI-generated voices. I originally made these episodes to support my own learning and review, and I'm sharing them publicly in case they're helpful to other busy clinicians and learners. Because the voices are synthetic, you may occasionally hear mispronunciations of medical terms, drug names, or author names. Thanks in advance for your patience. Everything you'll hear is for education only and not medical advice. Let's get into today's paper. This week on PRISM Rounds, we look at a secondary analysis asking whether crystalloid choice matters differently under liberal versus restrictive sepsis resuscitation strategies. The key message is that fluid type may not act independently of resuscitation strategy. This episode explores what that interaction means, how to interpret it cautiously, and what, if anything, it should change at the bedside. If you have questions, feedback, or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to reach out at broncoscope@gmail.com.
Today's paper is the CLOVERS DAISY analysis, and this is one of those papers that immediately creates tension on rounds. Because somebody says, use balanced fluids. Somebody else says, it probably does not matter. And somehow the intern is standing there holding saline and lactated ringers like it is an ICU game show.
Exactly. And the paper asks a genuinely useful question. Not just balanced crystalloids versus saline, whether fluid type behaves differently depending on the resuscitation strategy. That is the key move here.
Right, because the parent CLOVERS trial compared liberal fluids versus a restrictive early vasopressor approach and did not find a mortality difference, but it did not really answer whether fluid composition modifies that strategy effect.
This secondary analysis included 1,563 patients from CLOVERS. They were grouped by predominant fluid over the first 24 hours. Balanced crystalloids, normal saline, or mixed fluids. Predominant meant more than 80% of crystalloid exposure.
And the headline is the interaction. In the liberal arm, balanced crystalloids had the lowest mortality. In the restrictive arm, normal saline had the lowest mortality. That is the result that makes you stop scrolling and actually read the methods.
The liberal arm numbers are pretty striking. Adjusted mortality with balanced crystalloids was 12.6%, with saline 16.8%, with mixed fluids 16.1%.
But in the restrictive arm, the pattern flips. Balanced crystalloids were 16.3%, saline was 13.2%, mixed fluids were 14.1%.
And the overall fluid by strategy interaction was highly significant. That is the real statistical message. Not every within-arm pairwise comparison is definitive, but the interaction itself is hard to ignore.
So now the obvious bedside question. Is saline suddenly better, or is this really telling us that fluid type matters more when the dose is higher?
I think the second interpretation is much more plausible. The physiologic story is dose response. If you give more saline, you deliver more chloride. That increases the chance of hyperchloremic acidosis and adverse renal hemodynamics. Balanced fluids blunt that exposure.
Which fits the biologic data here. Higher bicarbonate, lower chloride, lower creatinine with balanced fluids. And those differences were most apparent in the liberal arm.
Exactly. So the lab signal and the mortality signal move in the same direction. That does not prove causality. But it does make the result feel more coherent and less like pure noise.
Renal outcomes were a little messier, though.
Yes. There was a significant interaction for new RRT, but not for RT-free days. And the secondary outcomes were exploratory, without multiple comparison adjustment. So this is where we stay interested, but disciplined.
The methods are worth pausing on for a second. This was not randomized by fluid type. They used inverse probability weighting with covariate balancing. So thoughtful methods, but still a secondary analysis.
Right. Residual confounding is still possible. And exposure was defined over the first 24 hours, which always raises questions about timing and early deaths. To their credit, they did sensitivity analyses, including excluding patients who died within 24 hours, and the pattern remained.
So what do we actually do with this on rounds tomorrow morning?
My practical take is pretty simple. If I am using a more liberal fluid strategy in early sepsis, balanced crystalloids still look like the better default. If I am using a restrictive early vasopressor strategy, fluid type may matter
A whole lot less. Or, even favor normal saline.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that is the entire puzzle of early sepsis resuscitation we are trying to solve here. I mean, for years, we have treated IV fluids like a religious war.
Oh, it completely is.
You are either a saline purist or you are a lactated Ringer's convert.
Right.
We stand at the bedside arguing over the color of the bag, but we have been asking the wrong question entirely.
We have been ignoring the operational context.
Yeah.
Because the stakes for you listening on rounds, well, they are incredibly high.
Yeah, they are.
I mean, sepsis remains the leading cause of mortality in the United States. And intravenous fluid is the absolute cornerstone of our initial management.
Absolutely.
Yet clinical practice varies wildly from hospital to hospital. It varies from attending to attending on the exact same unit.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It really is. So this secondary analysis of the CLOVERS trial finally gives us a framework to reconcile years of completely conflicting data.
Right. So the explicit goal of this deep dive today is to dissect this paper, which was published in Chest Critical Care in 2026. Because to really grasp why this analysis matters, we have to look back.
We need to understand the historical whiplash.
Exactly. Think about the tension you feel on rounds today. It comes from a very specific sequence of clinical trials. So let us walk through the recent history of the fluid wars, because the pendulum swings have been violent.
Oh, the timeline is fascinating.
Yeah.
Let us start with the SMART trial from a few years ago.
Right, the big one.
Yeah. This was a massive cluster crossover trial in the ICU. It compared balanced crystalloids to normal saline.
And the results were practice-changing.
They were. It showed a mortality and renal benefit with balanced crystalloids.
That study effectively shifted the paradigm overnight.
It really did. You walked into the unit, and suddenly saline was the enemy.
Oh, we were ripping bags of saline off the IV pole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We were all reaching for lactated Ringers, or plasma-like.
Because the SMART data was compelling.
Right. It felt biologically plausible. Saline has too much chloride. Chloride causes acidosis. Acidosis hurts kidneys.
It all made perfect sense.
The physiological narrative was very clean. But then the pendulum swung back just a few years later.
Yeah, here comes the whiplash.
Right. We saw the BASICS trial published out of Brazil.
Yeah.
And the PLUS trial testing plasmolate 148 versus saline.
Massive, rigorous, randomized controlled trials.
Exactly. And they found no significant differences whatsoever. No difference in 90-day mortality. No difference in the need for new RRT.
Total whiplash for the frontline clinician.
Right.
I mean, 1 year you were told you are harming kidneys with saline.
Right.
The next year you are told it does not matter at all. So you are standing at the bedside, your patient is hypotensive, their lactate is climbing.
And the literature feels like it is contradicting itself.
You feel paralyzed.
Which brings us to the parent CLOVERS trial. The trial this new paper is actually based on. The original CLOVERS researchers looked at this mess and, well, they asked a different question entirely.
They did not ask about fluid type.
No, they asked about fluid volume and resuscitation strategy.
Which is like, they wanted to know how we drive the car, not what fuel we put in it.
That is a brilliant way to put it. The parent CLOVERS trial compared a liberal fluid strategy, meaning you prioritize high volumes of IV fluid for hypotension,
Right.
versus a restrictive strategy, meaning you favor early vasopressor use in the first 24 hours.
You limit the fluid boluses and get the norepinephrine going quickly.
Exactly. And the results of that parent CLOVERS trial were also somewhat surprising to the field.
Because there was no overall mortality difference between the liberal and restrictive arms.
None. There was no difference in new RRT either. Both strategies appeared safe and equivalent overall.
Neither strategy won. But here is the missing puzzle piece, the glaring hole in the data.
Right.
The original CLOVERS trial left fluid composition completely up to the treating clinician.
They randomized the strategy, but they did not randomize the type of fluid.
You could use saline or balanced fluids in either arm.
That created a major gap in our knowledge. I mean, we knew strategy did not change mortality on its own. We knew fluid type was a mixed bag in previous trials.
But nobody had rigorously looked at the interaction between the two.
Right. There was a previous secondary analysis by Gelbenegger and colleagues. They looked at fluid types in this same CLOVERS cohort.
Oh, right.
But they only looked at fluids given before randomization.
Just the fluids given in the ambulance or like the first hour in the ED?
Exactly. They missed all the post-randomization exposure, the bulk of the resuscitation.
Which is a huge chunk of data.
And crucially, they did not stratify their results by the resuscitation strategy the patient was randomized to.
Which brings me back to my favorite analogy for this whole mess. Think of it like testing a car.
Okay.
Prior trials were just asking, which fuel is better? gasoline or diesel, but they were completely ignoring how big the engine was or how fast you were driving the car. You cannot evaluate the fuel without knowing the operating conditions.
That is the perfect way to frame it. If you are barely pushing the engine, the fuel type might not matter. You might not notice a difference.
Exactly.
But if you are running it at maximum capacity on a racetrack, well, it might matter a whole lot.
So this paper suggests that strategy and composition are inextricably linked.
You cannot study them in isolation anymore.
We have to stop treating all sepsis fluid choices as a one-size-fits-all problem. But, before we blindly trust these new results, we have to look closely at the study design.
We really do.
We need to understand how they built this analysis, because finding clear answers in unrandomized data is incredibly difficult.
It is. This was a secondary analysis pulling 1,563 patients from the CLOVERS trial. And the researchers had a very specific challenge.
Right, since the parent trial did not randomize the fluid type.
Exactly. They had to figure out how to group these patients retrospectively. They needed a strict definition of exposure.
Because patients get a chaotic mix of fluids in reality. They get what EMS hangs in the back of the rig.
Yeah.
Then they get whatever the ED attending prefers. Then they roll up to the ICU and we change all the bags.
It is never just one fluid.
Never.
That messy reality is why the researchers grouped patients by the predominant crystalloid administered.
Over what time frame?
They looked at the window from presentation through the first 24 hours. And they set a very high bar for the word predominant.
What was the cutoff?
It meant greater than 80% of their total crystalloid exposure had to be one specific type.
Wow, that is strict. So they created 3 distinct buckets.
Right.
First, the balanced crystalloids group. That captured 27% of the patients. Second, the normal saline group. That was 14% of the patients.
Okay.
And third, the mixed fluids group, which was a massive 58% of the patients.
That huge mixed group perfectly reflects the chaos of clinical care you just mentioned.
It really does.
Patients transition through different phases of care. They receive different fluids from different teams. Meeting an 80% purity threshold is actually quite hard in a modern hospital.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It is also important to note what was explicitly excluded from this math. Albumin, blood products, and small volumes of 5E medications were not counted in the denominator.
Just the raw, heavy resuscitation crystalloids.
Exactly.
So who were these patients? Paint a picture of the baseline demographics for us. Are these the same septic patients we see every day?
They give us a very clear picture of the typical sepsis patient. The mean age was 59.5 years. They were 47% female. The cohort was mostly white, about 71%.
Okay, pretty standard.
And this next detail is crucial for you to remember on rounds. 92% of the randomization happened in the emergency department.
Wow, so they were enrolled before they even saw the ICU doors?
Correct. Only about 6.8% were randomized in the ICU. So this data represents very early sepsis care, the golden hours.
And how sick were they?
Very sick. They had a median SOFA score of 3.4 at baseline.
Okay. A SOFA score of 3.4 means real, measurable organ dysfunction. They are profoundly hypotensive. Maybe their creatinine's already bumping. Maybe their platelets are dropping.
Right.
But let me put on my pragmatic clinician hat for a second. I have to express some deep skepticism here.
I figured you might.
This is secondary, non-randomized data. I always hate looking at non-randomized data for interventions because how do we know the saline group was not just sicker to begin with?
That is a valid concern.
Maybe the ED attending saw a patient actively crashing and just grabbed the closest bag of normal saline from the crash cart. Confounding by indication is a massive risk here.
It is.
Sick people might just get more saline by pure chance.
You are absolutely right to push back. The researchers knew confounding by indication could destroy their results, and they used some heavy statistical lifting to account for it.
Which was what, exactly?
Specifically, they used inverse probability of treatment weighting, or IPTW.
Okay, break down IPTW for us. Give me the plain English version, because our eyes usually glaze over when we hit the methods section.
Think of IPTW as a way to create a mathematically level playing field.
Okay.
Since they could not randomize the patients prospectively, they mathematically adjusted the groups retrospectively. First, they calculated a propensity score for every single patient.
A propensity score for what?
This score predicts how likely that specific patient was to receive a certain fluid based entirely on their baseline characteristics.
So you look at how sick they are, and guess what fluid they would normally get? What kind of baseline characteristics are we talking about?
They used covariate balancing for 11 different factors: age, sex, race, baseline comorbidities, baseline SOFA score,
That makes sense.
initial lactate levels, the suspected source of the infection, mechanical ventilation status, baseline vasopressor use before randomization, even the specific hospital site they were admitted to.
And of course, the randomization arm from the parent trial.
Yes, exactly.
So if a patient was very sick, older, and already on a ventilator, their propensity score reflected that high severity of illness.
Precisely. Then they apply the weights.
How does the weighting work?
Let us say a patient received saline, but based on their score, they looked exactly like someone who usually gets balanced fluids at that hospital.
Okay.
That patient gets a higher mathematical weight in the final analysis. They count for more.
Oh, I see.
While a patient who got the expected fluid counts for less. It artificially balances the scales so the groups look identical at baseline.
It is like a golf handicap system. You mathematically add strokes to the better players so you can have a fair match.
That is a great analogy.
But did it actually work? Did they successfully balance the scales?
They did. We measure that balance using something called the standardized mean difference. The statistical goal is to get that difference below 0.10 for every variable.
And did they hit that?
After they applied the IPTW method, every single one of those 11 covariates hit an acceptable standardized mean difference of less than 0.10.
Oh.
Within each strategy arm, the groups were statistically indistinguishable at baseline.
That is incredibly reassuring. It means we are comparing apples to mathematically adjusted apples, not sick saline patients to healthy lactated ringers patients.
Exactly.
So before we look at who survived, we need to look at what they actually received during those first critical 24 hours, the resuscitation reality.
This is where the strategy differences from the parent trial become very visible. Let us talk about volume first.
Yeah, the sheer volume of fluids given in modern sepsis care is impressive.
It really is. Even before randomization happened, the median fluid given was already around 2,050 milliliters.
That is your standard initial 2-liter ED bolus. Everyone gets that before they even enter the trial protocol. It is practically a reflex at this point.
It is. By 24 hours, the cumulative volumes were high across all the groups. Roughly 4,640 milliliters for the balanced crystalloids group.
Wow.
About 4,510 milliliters for the normal saline group, and 4,200 milliliters for the mixed group.
We are talking 4 to almost 5 liters of fluid in 24 hours. That is a massive fluid load, a huge physiological stress test for the kidneys and the lungs.
Definitely.
Now, what about the vasopressors? When did they reach for the norepinephrine?
Vasopressor use was also very common. It was utilized in 44% of the balanced crystalloids patients, 40% of the normal saline patients, and 52% of the mixed fluid patients.
What shocked me looking at the data was how fast they moved. They had pressors going in under 2.5 hours across the board.
Yeah, it was fast.
The mean time to the first vasopressor was about 2.3 to 2.4 hours. That is incredibly aggressive for a busy emergency department.
It shows a very modern approach to shock recognition.
Yeah.
We're no longer waiting 6 hours to start a central line and pressors.
Right, we're starting peripheral pressors early.
But we have to point out the obvious contrast between the two trial arms. Volumes were inherently higher in the liberal arm, while vasopressor use was much more common in the restrictive arm.
That was the whole point of the CLOVERS design. Force the clinicians into two different physiological environments.
Let us look at the balanced crystalloid group as an example of this contrast. In the restrictive arm, 56% of them received a vasopressor.
Okay.
In the liberal arm, only 36% received a vasopressor.
Conversely, the liberal arm received significantly more fluid volume overall.
Right, they were pushed to keep giving boluses instead of turning up the drip.
So we have two very different ways to treat shock. One is a high-volume, lower-pressure environment. The other is a low-volume, higher-pressure environment.
Both achieved the same blood pressures, but they got there using completely different tools.
Which sets up the primary outcome perfectly, the mortality flip.
This is the core revelation of the paper. Now that we understand the robust methodology and the actual therapies they received at the bedside, let us look at who survived to 90 days.
Start with the raw, unstratified numbers, the data, before we look at the specific strategies.
If you just look at the raw, unstratified 90-day mortality, it looks like this. 17.7% for balanced crystalloids, 21.3% for normal saline, 24.4% for mixed fluids.
Okay, if you stop reading there, balanced crystalloids look like the clear winner overall, a nearly 4% absolute mortality benefit over saline.
Right.
But you mentioned earlier that looking at the average is highly misleading.
It is deeply misleading because it completely ignores the strategy interaction.
Yeah.
You cannot just look at the average performance of the fuel. You have to break it down by how hard the engine was running.
Okay, let us look at the liberal arm first. The patients getting pushed with high fluid volumes.
The adjusted mortality here was 12.6% for balanced crystalloids versus 16.8% for normal saline.
That is a massive, absolute risk reduction.
It is a clear, undeniable win for balanced crystalloids in the liberal arm. If you were giving a lot of fluid, saline performs poorly. The mortality jumps significantly.
But here is the counterintuitive twist.
Let us look at the restrictive arm.
The low-volume early pressor arm.
In the restrictive arm, balanced crystalloid mortality was 16.3%, while normal saline mortality dropped to 13.2%.
Wow. I want to make sure the listener hears that clearly. Saline actually outperformed balanced crystalloids when fluid volumes were restricted.
The pattern completely flips.
Saline goes from being the worst option to the best option.
The statistics rigorously back this up. The strategy by fluid interaction was highly significant. The p-value was less than 0.001.
That is not borderline. That is a very robust statistical signal. It is not a fluke of the data. I saw they used flexible parametric survival models to calculate this. They specifically used natural cubic splines?
Yes, they did.
Why did they not just use standard hazard ratios? We see hazard ratios in almost every ICU trial.
They had to use splines because the proportional hazards assumption was not met.
Okay, meaning what?
In simple terms, a standard hazard ratio assumes the risk of dying between two groups is constant over time. If treatment A is twice as bad as treatment B on day 1, it should be twice as bad on day 90.
But biology does not work like that. Let me use a car race analogy.
I like it.
Proportional hazards assumes two cars are driving at consistently different speeds for the whole race. But what if one car crashes early and the other breaks down late? The relative risk changes constantly throughout the race.
That is a great way to visualize it.
Yeah.
The survival curves in this study split early and then behaved differently over time. The risk was not constant, so they used natural cubic splines.
What do splines do differently?
Splines allow the mathematical model to bend and adapt flexibly to those changing risks over the 90 days. It provides a much more accurate estimate of mortality than a single rigid hazard ratio.
Interesting, but I have to push back here with a clinically vital question.
Sure.
Let us look at that restrictive arm again. Saline mortality was 13.2%. Balanced crystalloids were 16.3%.
Right.
Is normal saline actually a drug that works better under restrictive conditions? Does it have some secret therapeutic property when given in small doses alongside pressors?
That is a tough question.
Or is this just statistical noise masking the fact that saline is just less harmful at low doses?
That is the million-dollar physiological question. Is saline actively beneficial in small doses or just less toxic?
Right.
To answer your pushback, we have to shift our focus to the biological plausibility. We need to dissect the physiologic why behind these mortality numbers.
Let us look at the laboratory data from the trial. They tracked labs across days 1 through 3.
The lab trends tell a very coherent mechanical story. Patients receiving balanced crystalloids had higher bicarbonate levels, they had lower chloride levels, and they had lower creatinine levels compared to the saline patients.
So better acid-base status and better renal function. Less acidosis, happier kidneys.
Crucially, these gaps between the groups were much larger in the liberal strategy arm. The lab differences widened significantly when the volume went up.
Let me translate this for you listening on rounds. The poison is in the dose. That is the classic dose-response theory.
Think about what normal saline actually is. It is a highly concentrated chloride solution. It has 154 milliequivalents of chloride per liter, which is much higher than normal human plasma, which sits around 100.
So when you give large volumes of saline, like in the liberal arm, you are delivering a massive, unnatural chloride load to the patient.
Exactly. That drives a hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis. It narrows the strong ion difference.
And we know from basic renal physiology what chloride does. High chloride delivery to the macula densa in the kidney causes afferent arterial or vasoconstriction.
It literally clamps down on the blood flow to the glomerulus.
Right. It reduces the glomerular filtration rate. It hammers the renal hemodynamics.
Components fluids, on the other hand, have physiological levels of chloride. And they contain a buffer, like lactate or acetate, which the liver converts to bicarbonate.
So in the liberal arm, saline is causing real, measurable physiologic harm. The sheer volume of chloride is toxic.
It is.
But what about the restrictive arm? Why did saline win there?
The restrictive physiology explains the mortality flip. When you severely limit fluid volume, like they did in the restrictive strategy arm. The total chloride load from saline is simply too small to cause significant harm.
The dose of poison is too low to cause the vasoconstriction.
Exactly.
But does it actually help? Why would the mortality be lower than balanced fluids?
This is where we get into physiological theory. There are a few reasons saline might actively perform well in a restrictive high-pressure environment.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, normal saline is slightly hyperosmolar compared to lactated ringers.
True.
It might pull slightly more fluid into the intravascular space per milliliter given, which is highly desirable when you are restricting total volume.
You get more bang for your buck with your volume expansion. You keep the pipes full without overloading the lungs.
Exactly. Second, there was some older literature suggesting that mild hyperchloremia might actually augment vascular tone.
Really?
Yeah. It might make alpha receptors more responsive to endogenous and exogenous catecholamines.
So your early vasopressors might work more efficiently in a slightly high chloride environment. That is fascinating.
The chloride might actually be helping the norepinephrine clamp down on the vessels.
While the volume is kept low enough to protect the kidneys from the macula densa effect, it perfectly aligns with post hoc analyses of the BASICS trial, too.
It is a beautiful validation of that concept. The BASICS trial suggested that balanced crystalloids are most beneficial in sepsis patients receiving the highest fluid volumes.
And when the volume is low, the benefit vanishes.
The lab signals and the mortality signals in this CLOVERS analysis are pointing in the exact same direction, which gives us much more confidence that this interaction is real.
But if chloride is hammering the kidneys in the liberal arm, that damage has to show up somewhere clinically.
It should.
We should see it in the dialysis rates. This brings us to the messy middle of the paper, the renal clinical outcomes.
We have seen the mortality and the basic lab values align perfectly, but the actual clinical renal outcomes introduce a baffling contradiction.
Let us look at the data on new renal replacement therapy, or new RRT initiating dialysis in the ICU, the ultimate sign of kidney failure.
There was a significant statistical interaction for new RRT. The p-value was 0.041.
Okay.
But the direction of the effect makes no sense at first glance.
Why?
In the liberal arm, normal saline was associated with a lower frequency of new RRT than balanced crystalloids.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing this right.
Yeah, 1.6% for saline versus 2.9% for balanced crystalloids.
In the liberal arm, saline had higher mortality. It had worse creatinine. It had worse acidosis. But fewer of those patients ended up on the dialysis machine.
Yes, that is the paradox.
How is that physiologically possible? How do saline patients have worse kidneys but less dialysis?
The authors offer some excellent evidence-based speculation to unpack this paradox. The most likely explanation is something called competing risks.
Specifically, early deaths in the normal saline group, meaning they died before they could get to RRT. Let us walk through a grim clinical scenario. A patient comes in floridly septic. They get 5 liters of saline. They develop profound hyperchloremic acidosis. Their pH drops to 7.1. They arrest and die on day 1 or day 2.
That patient never lives long enough to meet the clinical criteria for dialysis on day 3 or 4.
Right.
They are not counted in the new RRT metric because dead patients do not get dialyzed. The higher early mortality in the saline group literally artificially lowers their RRT rate.
That is a dark but very realistic explanation of how ICU statistics work. What else could explain this paradox?
Variations in the local criteria for starting RRT. Remember, this trial spanned 60 different hospitals across the country. There was no standardized protocol for when to initiate dialysis.
It was entirely left up to the discretion of the local attending.
Right.
And practice varies wildly there, too.
Right.
Some attendings pull the trigger early for mild acidosis or a bumping potassium,
While others wait for absolute anuria and severe volume overload.
When practice is that subjective, the data gets very noisy.
The third explanation is simply a lack of statistical power for this specific sub-outcome.
Because the event rates were low.
Exactly. The overall rate of new RRT was quite low across the board, under 3% in most groups. When event rates are that low, the confidence intervals get very wide.
And weird things can happen in subgroup analyses just by chance.
Exactly.
So we take the RRT finding with a massive grain of salt. What about the other secondary markers at day 28? Did they align with the mortality benefit?
The secondary markers broadly supported the primary mortality finding. Organ support free days were modestly higher with balanced crystalloids.
Good.
ICU free days were also modestly but consistently higher with balanced crystalloids.
And the SOFA scores. Did the organ failure resolve faster?
SOFA scores over the first 72 hours drop more significantly with balanced crystalloids, a median drop of -0.9 for balanced crystalloids, compared to only -0.3 for normal saline.
So the patients getting balanced fluids had a faster resolution of their overall organ failure. That tracks perfectly with the survival benefit.
It really does.
But before we fundamentally change our clinical practice based on a secondary analysis, we have to try and break the study's logic. That is what pragmatic attendings do on rounds. We look for the fatal flaw in the methodology.
The most obvious flaw we have to look for in a trial designed like this is immortal time bias. It is a classic trap in observational cohort studies.
Explain immortal time bias for us. How does it skew data?
It happens when you define a patient's exposure over a broad window of time. In this study, they defined the predominant fluid over the first 24 hours. They looked back at the 24-hour mark and calculated the percentages.
Right.
But to be properly categorized based on a 24-hour window, the patient has to actually survive for 24 hours.
Oh, I see. If a patient dies at hour 6 from refractory shock, they might get misclassified.
Exactly.
Because they never had the chance to receive their full fluid allocation. Maybe they only got 1 liter of saline before they coded, but if they had lived, they would have gotten 3 liters of balanced fluids.
Their time before death is considered immortal in the statistical model if you are not careful. Because by definition, you cannot die during the window of time required to define your exposure.
It artificially makes the groups look like they have different baseline survival rates.
Exactly. So the researchers ran a rigorous sensitivity analysis to fix this. They set time zero exactly at the moment of randomization, and they repeated all of their mortality models, strictly excluding any patients who died within the first 24 hours.
They removed the immortal time entirely. And what happened to the results when they did that?
The mortality pattern held firm. It barely budged.
Really?
Yeah. The liberal arm still significantly favored balanced crystalloids. The restrictive arm still favored normal saline. So immortal time bias does not explain these findings away. The physiologic interaction is real.
That makes the data much stronger. What about the definition of predominant? They chose an arbitrary 80% threshold. What if a patient got 79% saline? Did they test moving the goalposts?
They did a comprehensive threshold sensitivity analysis. They tested redefining predominant as 70%. Then they tested 80%, then 90%, and even a strict 95% purity threshold of total fluids.
And did the interaction hold?
The results did not change at all. The specific percentage threshold did not alter the fundamental interaction between resuscitation strategy and fluid type, whether you used a loose definition or a strict definition. Saline was bad in high volumes and good in low volumes.
So the data holds up to the mathematical stress tests, but we still need to acknowledge the unavoidable limitations of the paper. We cannot treat this like a prospective randomized trial.
We absolutely must list the caveats. First and foremost, this remains a post hoc secondary analysis.
Meaning it is inherently hypothesis generating, not definitive proof.
Exactly. Causal inference is always limited in observational data. Even with excellent IPTW adjustments, there might be unmeasured confounders we simply cannot see.
We also mentioned the RRT criteria weren't standardized across the 60 hospitals,
Right.
which makes interpreting the renal outcomes very difficult.
Correct. And another major limitation is that time-dependent exposure models weren't used.
What does that mean in practical terms at the bedside?
It means the statistical models could not track the minute-by-minute changes that happened during a real resuscitation. Fluid boluses and vasopressor titrations happen simultaneously.
Right, you go up on the presser, you see the blood pressure drop, you give a fluid bolus, you turn the presser back down.
It is a highly dynamic, interactive dance between the nurse and the physician. The researchers could not model that high-resolution, time-varying confounding. They only had the aggregate 24-hour data buckets to work with.
They know what happened at the end of the day, but they don't know the exact sequence of events that got the patient there.
Exactly.
Which means there is always room for a future prospective trial to get even more granular, to randomize the fluid type A and D, the strategy simultaneously.
Hopefully we see that trial soon.
But for now, this is the best data we have. And it brings us to the bottom line, the takeaway for you, the listener. When you are on rounds tomorrow morning and that intern is standing there holding 2 different bags of fluid, waiting for your order.
Right.
Here is the succinct bedside summary. The clinical impact of your fluid choice is heavily modulated by your volume strategy.
Yes.
If you are running a liberal fluid strategy, if you are prioritizing volume expansion and reaching for higher volumes, you should absolutely reach for balanced crystalloids.
Without question.
The chloride load of saline is simply too toxic at high doses. It will cause hyperchloremic acidosis, and it will increase mortality. But if you are running a restrictive fluid strategy,
Which is becoming more common.
if you are relying on early peripheral vasopressors and strictly limiting your volume boluses, normal saline is likely fine.
It might even be slightly better, perhaps due to its higher osmolarity or its ability to augment vascular tone.
It fundamentally changes how we view early sepsis resuscitation. We can no longer just ask, what fluid should I give?
No, we have to ask, what fluid for what strategy? The two variables are locked together.
They really are.
But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Building on everything we have discussed about chloride toxicity and the macula densa.
Let us hear it.
Yeah.
Where is the future of this going?
If the harm of saline is purely a dose response to chloride, shouldn't we stop prescribing static, blind fluid strategies entirely?
What do you mean by blind?
Think about how blunt our tools are right now in the ICU. We guess at the volume, we give a liter, check a blood pressure, give another liter.
Yeah, it is a lot of guesswork.
Imagine a future where we have continuous, real-time chloride sensors attached to a patient's Foley catheter.
Oh, wow. Monitoring the exact composition of the urine output minute by minute.
Exactly. These sensors could tell us exactly the minute their kidneys have hit their saline limit. The moment the chloride load begins to cause that dangerous afferent arterial or vasoconstriction.
And then that sensor automatically signals the IV pump.
Yes, telling it to stop the saline and switch to balanced crystalloids, or automatically signaling the pump to dial up the vasopressors instead.
A fully closed loop, physiologically responsive resuscitation system, driven entirely by real-time renal biomarkers.
It will be revolutionary.
That is incredible to think about. We go from standing around arguing about the color of the fluid bags on rounds to letting the patient's own kidneys dictate their real-time therapy.
It is the ultimate endpoint of this dose-response logic we discussed today. Personalized, high-resolution resuscitation.
And that is a perfect place to wrap up. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We took you from the historical whiplash of the fluid wars, through the statistical weeds of IKTW and natural cubic splines, all the way to a practical, nuanced bedside strategy you can use on your next shift.
And a glimpse into the automated ICU of tomorrow.
It is always a pleasure to unpack these complex physiological papers.
Absolutely.
So tomorrow, when you look at that hypotensive patient in shock, remember that the X-ray of their pneumonia might be murky. But the strategy for their fluids does not have to be. Match the fluid to the strategy. Until next time, keep questioning the defaults.
Thank you for spending your time with PRISM Rounds. If this episode helped you think through the paper or offered something practical for the bedside, I'd be grateful if you'd like, follow/subscribe, and share it with a colleague. It's the simplest way to help this resource reach other busy clinicians and learners. I'm also trying to make the podcast better with every episode. Please leave a comment with what you found most useful, what felt unclear or too long, and what topics or papers you'd like covered next. If there's anything I can do to improve, pacing, structure, level of detail, or audio quality, I genuinely welcome the feedback. Thanks again for listening, and take care. Educational use only. This is not medical advice.